I bought a lakefront property for almost nothing and accidentally shut down an entire HOA's biggest moneymaker. If you love watching HOAs lose control of something they never actually owned, hit subscribe. This one gets really satisfying really fast. I bought 8 acres of lakefront land at a quiet county auction. I didn't know it yet, but I had just purchased the single reason an entire HOA charged its residents $400 a year for something they no longer had any right to use. Within a month, 300 paid memberships became completely worthless, and the HOA had absolutely no idea how to explain that to their own residents. If you love watching entitled HOAs lose control of something they never actually owned, subscribe now, because this story ends with an entire community demanding refunds nobody expected to happen. I found the listing almost by accident, scrolling through county tax delinquent property auctions the way I did most weekends, mostly out of curiosity rather than any real intention to buy. 8 acres, lakefront access, minimal structures, back taxes owed for nearly 6 years. The starting bid was embarrassingly low for lakefront property anywhere near a decent-sized body of water. I drove out to see it before bidding, expecting maybe scrubby brush and unusable shoreline, the kind of reason lakefront land sometimes sits neglected for years. Instead, I found something that made me stop the car and just stare for a long moment. A pristine, gently sloped shoreline. A small dock, weathered but structurally sound, and parked along the access road leading toward it, at least a dozen vehicles, all bearing the same small parking permit sticker in their rear windows. I didn't think much of the stickers at first. I figured maybe it was some kind of local fishing club, or perhaps residents from a nearby subdivision who'd worked out an informal arrangement with whoever previously owned the land. I placed my bid that same week. Nobody else did. 3 weeks later, I was the legal owner of 8 acres that, as it turned out, an entire community had been treating as their own private amenity for the better part of a decade. I didn't fully understand what I'd actually purchased until I mentioned it casually to a woman working the counter at the local bait shop. "Wait," she said, pausing mid-transaction. "You bought the Willowbrook Fishing Access? The one behind Cedar Ridge Estates? I guess? Is that a big deal?" She laughed, the kind of laugh that told me I genuinely had no idea what I just walked into. That's the whole reason people pay for a premium HOA membership over there. Cedar Ridge charges an extra $400 a year specifically for lake access privileges. That parcel you bought is the only usable shoreline access point for their entire neighborhood. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something between amusement and genuine curiosity building steadily. An entire HOA had been charging residents a premium fee for years, specifically to access land they apparently never actually owned. I drove back out to the property the next morning, this time paying much closer attention to what I was actually looking at. A weathered wooden sign near the access road read, "Cedar Ridge Estates, Lake Access. Members only," complete with a small laminated map showing designated fishing spots along the shoreline. "Members only," posted on land that legally entirely belonged to me. I pulled up county records that same afternoon, tracing the property's ownership history back as far as I could. The parcel had been privately owned by an elderly man who'd passed away nearly 8 years earlier, with no immediate heirs claiming the property. Back taxes had accumulated steadily ever since, the county eventually seizing it for the delinquent tax auction where I'd found it, which meant for the entire 8 years since that man's death, Cedar Ridge Estates had been operating their premium lake access membership program on land that legally belonged to nobody but an unclaimed estate, slowly accumulating unpaid taxes while residents paid real, actual money for privileges that existed on increasingly shaky legal ground. I sat in my car outside that property, staring at that members only sign, feeling a decision starting to form in my mind. I hadn't bought this land with any grand scheme in mind. I'd genuinely just seen a good price on decent lakefront property, but now that I understood exactly what I'd purchased and exactly how many people apparently depended on access I now legally controlled, I found myself wondering something that felt almost too good to ignore. What would happen if I simply reminded 300 paying households exactly whose land they'd actually been using this entire time? I didn't act immediately. I wanted to understand the full situation first, so I spent the next several days doing exactly what I'd done with previous property discoveries, digging through public records, verifying everything before making any decisions that might affect an entire community. I pulled Cedar Ridge Estates' publicly available HOA fee schedule, and there it was, exactly as the bait shop clerk had described. a tiered membership structure, with a premium lake access tier costing $400 annually above standard HOA dues, specifically advertised as providing exclusive fishing and shoreline privileges at Willowbrook Access Point. 300 households paying that premium fee, $120,000 annually, generated specifically from access to land the association had never actually owned. I found something else buried in older HOA meeting minutes, archived online going back almost a decade. A brief mention, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it, referencing an informal arrangement with the property's previous owner allowing shared access in exchange for the HOA handling basic shoreline maintenance. An informal arrangement, not a lease, not an easement, not anything legally binding whatsoever, which meant this entire premium membership tier had been built, from the very beginning, on nothing more than a handshake agreement with an elderly landowner who had since passed away, followed by 8 years of the HOA, simply continuing to charge residents for access that had never been formally secured, protected, or guaranteed in any legal sense. I called a property attorney, a sharp, practical woman named Denise, recommended by a friend who'd handled land disputes involving informal access agreements before. This is actually a fairly common situation with older informal arrangements, she said after reviewing everything I'd found. Verbal or handshake agreements between neighbors or communities and private landowners often continue for years simply because nobody bothers formalizing them, right up until ownership changes hands and the new owner has no obligation to honor an arrangement they never personally agreed to. So, legally, I owe them nothing? Legally correct, she said. You're under no obligation to continue any informal access arrangement made by a previous owner, especially one that was never formalized through an actual easement or lease agreement filed with the county. I sat with that confirmation for a moment, feeling the full weight of what it actually meant. 300 households paying a premium fee for something I could legally end at any moment, with zero legal recourse available to them whatsoever. I still hadn't decided exactly what I wanted to do with that knowledge. Part of me considered simply letting things continue as they were, becoming an invisible landowner nobody ever thought to question, collecting nothing while residents kept using land they assumed was theirs. But then I drove out to the property one more time, partly out of curiosity, partly just to see the shoreline again in person before making any final decisions. I arrived to find at least 8 vehicles parked along the access road, residents fishing along the shoreline, a few families with children waiting near the dock. Completely normal, peaceful lakefront activity, except every single person there believed they were legally entitled to be there, unaware the actual legal owner was standing less than 50 yards away. One man noticed me watching and approached, friendly, unsuspecting. Beautiful morning for it, isn't it? You a member here too, or just visiting? I hesitated for a moment, genuinely unsure how to answer that question, honestly, without immediately appending his entire morning. Actually, I said carefully, I own this land. His expression shifted slowly from confusion into something closer to concern. Wait, you're not with the HOA? No, I said. I bought this property at auction a few weeks ago, completely separate from Cedar Ridge Estates. He stared at me for a long moment, processing that information. So, the HOA doesn't actually own this land? They never have, I said. As far as I can tell, they've been using it based on an informal arrangement with the previous owner, one that ended the moment he passed away 8 years ago. The man's face went through a series of expressions I recognized instantly, the same progression I'd experienced myself just days earlier. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that something he'd paid real money for years might have never actually been legally guaranteed in the first place. You need to talk to the HOA board, he said slowly. Because if what you're saying is true, a lot of people are about to be very, very upset. I didn't reach out to the HOA board immediately. Instead, I spent another week thinking carefully about how I actually wanted to handle this, talking through options with Denise, weighing what felt fair against what I was legally entitled to do. You have a few different paths here, Denise explained during our follow-up call. You could formalize a proper lease agreement with the HOA, charging fair market value for continued access. You could restrict access entirely, which is completely within your rights. Or you could simply let the situation play out naturally, informing them of the change, and letting them figure out how to handle their own membership program from there. That last option felt oddly appealing, Mostly because I genuinely wasn't interested in becoming some kind of landlord managing lake access permissions for 300 households. I decided instead to send a simple, formal letter to the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA board, informing them clearly of the property's ownership change and requesting a conversation regarding their continued use of what was now unambiguously my private property. I mailed that letter on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had a voicemail from someone identifying herself as the HOA board president, a woman named Patricia Renner, her tone carrying the specific blend of forced politeness and barely concealed panic I recognized from previous encounters with HOA leadership. I called her back that same afternoon. "I received your letter," she said, skipping any real greeting. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about the lake access arrangement." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "I own the property. The informal arrangement with the previous owner ended when he passed away. I'm simply informing you of that fact. That access point has been part of our community for nearly a decade," she said, her tone sharpening slightly. "Our residents pay specifically for that privilege. You can't just unilaterally decide to end something that's been established for that long." "Actually," I said calmly, "I can. There's no formal lease, no easement, nothing legally binding the property to continued access. I've had an attorney confirm this." There's a long pause on the line, the kind that told me she hadn't actually expected this level of preparedness from whoever had randomly purchased that parcel at auction. "What exactly are you proposing then?" she finally asked, her tone shifting into something more careful, more measured. "I haven't decided yet," I said honestly, "but I wanted you to have accurate information before your board makes any decisions about how to communicate this to your residents." She didn't respond well to that. "You understand this is going to cause significant problems for our community. People have paid for this access for years." "I understand that's a conversation you'll need to have with your residents," I said, "but that responsibility belongs to your board, not to me. I didn't create this situation. I simply purchased land that happened to include something your association apparently built an entire fee structure around without ever formalizing legal access." The call ended shortly after that, Patricia's tone noticeably colder than when we'd started, promising to discuss this with the full board before contacting me again. I didn't hear anything for nearly 2 weeks after that call, which felt strange given how urgent the situation clearly was for Cedar Ridge Estates. I later found out why, when a resident I'd spoken with previously reached out directly, having apparently gotten my number from the same friendly man I'd met at the Shoreline weeks earlier. "You need to know what's happening at our meetings," she said. "Patricia's telling everyone this is just a temporary legal dispute. Nothing to worry about, insisting the board is handling negotiations to secure permanent access." "That's not accurate," I said. "I haven't had any further contact with her since our initial call." The woman on the phone went quiet for a moment. "She's been collecting the premium membership fee renewal for next year already. Told everyone it was business as usual." I felt something shift uncomfortably in my chest at that information. Patricia wasn't just avoiding an uncomfortable conversation with her residents. She was actively continuing to collect money for access she now knew, with absolute certainty, no longer legally existed. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling genuine anger building for the first time throughout this entire situation. Up until now, I'd approached everything methodically, almost detached, treating this as an interesting legal curiosity rather than something requiring urgent action. Patricia collecting renewal fees for access she knew was legally compromised changed that completely. I called Denise immediately, explaining what I'd just learned. "That's potentially serious," she said, her tone sharpening noticeably. "If she's knowingly collecting fees for a service or privilege she has reason to believe no longer legally exists, that could constitute fraud, depending on how explicitly she's representing the situation to residents. What should I do?" "Document everything," Denise said. "Get that resident statement in writing if she's willing to provide it. We may need to involve the county consumer protection office, depending on how this develops." The woman who'd called me, whose name was Karen, agreed to provide a written statement confirming what Patricia had told residents during the recent meeting, along with a copy of the renewal notice she'd received, still explicitly advertising guaranteed premium lake access for the upcoming year. Guaranteed, in writing, for access Patricia had known, since our phone call at minimum no longer had any legal foundation whatsoever. I decided it was time to address this directly and publicly, rather than continuing to let Patricia control the narrative behind closed doors. I requested to speak at Cedar Ridge Estate's next scheduled community meeting, a request that notably took nearly a week of persistent follow-up before Patricia's office finally agreed to add me to the agenda. The meeting was packed by the time I arrived, considerably more residents present than I imagined typically attended routine HOA business. Word had clearly spread that something significant was happening, even if most residents didn't yet understand exactly what. Patricia opened the meeting with visible tension, addressing several unrelated agenda items first, clearly stalling before reaching the topic everyone had actually shown up for. When she finally introduced me, her tone carried a carefully rehearsed neutrality that didn't quite mask her obvious discomfort. I stood, thanked the room for the opportunity to speak, and laid out the situation exactly as it existed. I owned the lakefront parcel. The previous informal arrangement had ended upon the prior owner's death 8 years earlier. No formal lease or easement had ever been established, and I had documentation confirming Patricia was aware of this situation, yet had continued collecting premium membership renewal fees regardless. The room's reaction was immediate and audible. Dozens of separate conversations breaking out simultaneously, residents turning toward Patricia with expressions ranging from confusion to open anger. "Is that true?" one resident called out. "You knew this before sending our renewal notices?" Patricia's composure cracked slightly. I was in the process of negotiating a permanent solution. I didn't want to cause unnecessary panic before. "You didn't want to cause panic," an older man interrupted, standing up near the front. "So instead you just took our money anyway, for something you knew we might not actually get?" The murmurs grew louder, residents pulling out phones, some clearly already searching for their own renewal notices to check the exact wording Patricia had used. I let the room process everything for a moment before continuing. "I want to be clear that I'm not here trying to cause problems for your community. I simply believe residents deserve accurate information before deciding whether to pay for something that may not exist in the form they're expecting." Patricia stood up abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene once the board has had time to properly address these concerns." But as she said it, I noticed something happening throughout the room that told me this situation had already moved far beyond anything she could control through a hastily ended meeting. Residents weren't leaving. They were pulling out phones, comparing notes, several already discussing contacting a lawyer of their own. Because in that room, surrounded by neighbors who'd just learned they'd been deceived, Patricia wasn't just facing an angry community anymore. She was facing the very real possibility of a class action complaint. 3 weeks after that meeting, the situation had escalated far beyond anything Patricia could quietly manage. A group of residents, led by Karen and several others who'd attended that contentious meeting, had retained their own attorney to explore options regarding the premium membership fees they'd paid for access that, as it turned out, had legally ceased to exist nearly 8 years earlier. Their attorney reached out to Denise directly, requesting documentation confirming the property's ownership history and the exact timeline of when the previous informal arrangement had ended. Denise provided everything readily, given that none of it reflected poorly on me whatsoever. I'd simply purchased land at a legitimate auction and informed the HOA of the change as soon as I understood the situation. The resident's complaint, once formally filed, focused specifically on Patricia's continued collection of premium membership fees after she'd been directly informed, through my phone call weeks earlier, that the arrangement no longer had any legal foundation. Their attorney argued this constituted a clear pattern of consumer fraud, since residents had paid specifically for a service explicitly guaranteed in writing, despite Patricia's own knowledge that the guarantee was baseless. The case moved through the county's Consumer Protection Office fairly quickly, given the clarity of the timeline and documentation involved. Patricia's own admission during that community meeting that she'd known about the situation before sending renewal notices became perhaps the most damaging piece of evidence against her. I wasn't directly involved in the legal proceedings beyond providing documentation confirming the property's ownership history, but I followed the situation closely, curious how an entire community's trust in their HOA leadership would ultimately resolve itself. The county's ruling, when it finally arrived nearly 4 months later, required Cedar Ridge Estates to refund the entire premium membership fee to all 300 affected households for the current year, totaling exactly $120,000. Additionally, given the clear evidence of knowing misrepresentation, Patricia faced personal fines for consumer fraud violations, along with mandatory removal from her position as HOA board president. The community elected an entirely new board within 2 months of that ruling, implementing sweeping changes to how amenity-based fees were structured going forward. Any premium fee tied to a specific physical amenity now required documented proof of legal ownership or formal lease agreement, reviewed annually by an independent auditor, specifically to prevent anything resembling the Willowbrook situation from happening again. As for my property itself, I ended up doing something I hadn't originally planned, but which felt like the right resolution once everything settled. I offered Cedar Ridge Estates' new board a formal, properly documented lease agreement for continued shoreline access, charging a modest, fair annual fee, significantly lower than what residents had previously paid, specifically because I had no interest in profiting excessively from a situation that had already caused enough financial harm to an entire community. The new board accepted immediately, formalizing everything through proper legal channels this time, with an actual recorded easement filed with the county, protecting both my ownership rights and the community's continued access for years to come. I ran into Karen a few months later at the same bait shop where I'd first learned what I'd actually purchased. "Funny how this all started," she said, smiling. "You just wanted decent lakefront property and ended up exposing something that had been quietly wrong for almost a decade." "I really did just want the fishing spot," I said, laughing. "Well, now you've got it properly," she said. "And so do the rest of us, actually legally this time, instead of just assuming everything was fine, because nobody ever bothered checking." That comment stuck with me long after that conversation ended. This entire situation had never really been about lakefront property or premium membership fees, or even Patricia's specific dishonesty. It was about how easily an entire community can build years of routine, expectation, and financial commitment around something nobody ever actually verified, simply because questioning it felt unnecessary until someone finally had a reason to look closer. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can discover in a piece of property isn't the land itself. It's the truth an entire community had been quietly avoiding for years, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to finally ask who it actually belonged to. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might expose something even more surprising than a fishing spot nobody actually owned.